Hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science, hosted by the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Center for Philosophy of Science here at the University of Minnesota, and it is my great delight to introduce today Rune Nyrup, who is a philosopher working on ethics and epistemology of science, medicine, and technology at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence and the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. Before arriving at Cambridge for his postdoc, he did a PhD at Durham University. In addition to the work he's currently doing on ethical and epistemic issues that arise in AI systems and automated decision-making, he works on the role of different kinds of reasoning in sciences, such as analogy, diagnostic, explanatory, and how different types of values can and should influence scientific inquiry. That's the kind of focus we're going to get today in his talk. But let me highlight before we go there that he also has a number of publications that people might find interesting, forthcoming in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, Of Water Drops and Atomic Nuclei, Analogies and Pursuitworthiness in Science, and also from 2020, Strategies in Abduction, Generating and Selecting Diagnostic Hypotheses, from the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. So I would encourage you to interact with his work as is appropriate, but today we are hearing him talk about pursuitworthiness, inductive risk, and female Viking warriors. Please join with me in welcoming Rune. Rune, please.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen here. Whoops, that was the wrong one. There we go. All right, so that should be showing all right now. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Alan, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited to be here, and I've just realized that it's really appropriate to be talking about Vikings, given that I'm, in a sense, given this talk in Minnesota. That was not my intention when I came up with the topic, but I'm delighted that it turned out that way. Anyway, I can see that the screen is reflecting my glasses, so I'm just going to take them off. Okay. So I will just go ahead with my talk. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this notion of pursuitworthiness. And this is an idea that originally comes from Larry Lawton. Well, he at least coined the distinction between acceptance and pursuit in his book, Progress and Its Problems. So by acceptance here, I mean something like you accept a theory when you regard it as a piece of established scientific knowledge. So we can be agnostic about whether we want to construe that in a realist way or not. By pursuit, instead, we mean using your time and resources to develop a theory or test it or in some sense work on it. So obviously people had been talking about these things before, but Lawton was the first one to really coin that distinction. And one of the motivations for coining this distinction is that Lawton was pointing out that you can often find scientists in some sense defending a theory, even if they don't endorse it, they don't accept it. And so he argued that if you distinguish between these two kinds of theory choice, choosing it to accept a theory and choosing to pursue a theory, you can account for those kinds of situations. And so he argued that because these two kinds of theory choice obey different normative standards, they can come apart, and rationally so. So this is a distinction I've used in some of my previous work. So I have a paper where I argue that inference's best explanation can be interpreted as justifying pursuit rather than acceptance. And I've also applied some of these ideas to debates in archaeology about the use of analogy. And so archaeologists have often been very skeptical about the use of analogies. But I argue that if you interpret them as being about pursuit, then you can see how those uses of analogy can actually be rationally justified, even if they don't seem to be providing reasons for accepting a theory. So this is a picture that I think is correct. You distinguish between the normative standards for acceptance and pursuit. But in this talk, I want to complicate this picture a bit. So what I've started to think is that even though they are distinct normative standards for acceptance and pursuit, they're also in a certain sense entangled. And by entangled here, I mean that what you're going to say about the normative standards for one of them, for acceptance, for instance, is going to constrain what you're able to say about the normative standards for pursuit. And so because they're entangled in the way, and I'm going to tell you later on more about what I mean by that, you can't just investigate the two in isolation from each other. You need to give sort of a joint theory of the two, where you take into account what you say about one when you formulate your theory of the other. So here's the plan for the talk. I'm going to focus my argument specifically on inductive risk. And so I'm going to start by giving you a quick rundown of what I mean by, or how I understand the inductive risk literature, the aspects of it that's going to be relevant for my talk here. Then I'm going to look at some of the arguments around the relationship between pursuitworthiness and inductive risk. And I'm particularly going to look at some arguments that expand the scope of inductive risk arguments to include considerations about pursuit. I'm going to argue that that is one way you get this entanglement between acceptance and pursuit. Then I'm going to look at an argument from inductive risk. Well, I'm going to look at an argument from archaeology, which I think can be interpreted as an argument from inductive risk. And I'm going to argue that in that case, you get a particularly complex relationship between acceptance and pursuit. And finally, I'm going to look at a debate in recent archaeology over whether there's evidence for the existence of female Viking warriors. So I will just jump ahead with that. Okay, so here's how I would construe an argument from inductive risk. So you start from the observation that scientific inquiry in a certain domain is uncertain, and so that you run some risk of error. Then you notice that these different kinds of errors have different kinds of consequences. So, a classic example would be you're testing whether a given drug has any serious side effects, and if you get let me see if I get this right. If you get a false positive on that, if you get a false positive on whether it has bad side effects, that's one kind of error. It has certain consequences, namely that you will be delaying the approval of this drug, which could be bad because you might miss out on an effective treatment. On the other hand, if you get a false negative, then you would obviously be exposing patients to these negative side effects of the drug. So you have, depending on whether you get a false positive or a false negative, you have different kinds of consequences. Now, step 3, then you highlight certain kinds of methodological decisions which can foreseeably affect the balance on errors. So it can foreseeably affect whether you're more likely to get false positives and false negatives. And so you conclude that decision is value laden. By value laden here, I would understand it to mean that two individuals who can disagree rationally about whether that decision is the right one to make, because they disagree about their value judgments, and specifically because they disagree about how to value the different kinds of errors that you can commit. Now, to notice here that I'm not talking about the value-free ideal. So often arguments from inductive risk are construed as arguments about the value-free ideal. To get into that debate, you need to introduce some further ideas about what constitutes the core of scientific reasoning, or what an ideal model of scientific inquiry is. But that's not really going to be essential to my argument here. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to construe an argument from inductive risk in this way. So if you construe it in this narrow way, most philosophers of science would take this to be basically a valid form of reasoning. What they disagree about is how you should react to the fact that this decision is value laden. And so you get different accounts of how to manage inductive risk, and they give different accounts of how you should value the kinds of value judgments that goes into deciding whether that methodological decision is the right one to make. And I'm going to just canvas a few of the different accounts you find in the literature, just to put them on the table for going forward. So the standard account is the one that Rudner originally gave. So there, Rudner focused on acceptance thresholds. So how much evidence or how strong evidence should you require before you decide to accept or reject a hypothesis. So that's the classical case. Now, an alternative to this account, sorry, I should have said that what Rudner specifically argued is that he thought scientists themselves should make these decisions about what constitutes enough evidence for a hypothesis. So Betts has given an alternative account to resist this conclusion. So Betts argues that it's not appropriate for scientists to be making the kinds of value judgments necessary to set acceptance thresholds, because they don't have the legitimacy to be making value judgments on behalf of the people who will be relying on scientific results. So instead, he argues that scientists should only accept claims that are beyond reasonable doubt. And if you don't have enough evidence to just outright accept a certain claim, then you should instead accept a hedged claim. So a claim where you make all the relevant uncertainties explicit. So you might say something like, there is evidence that this drug has no adverse effects, or it is likely that it doesn't have any adverse effects, whatever you think is the appropriate way of expressing that uncertainty. And then ideally, you will express it in a way that will enable policymakers or whoever will be relying on those scientific results in their practical decision making to take those uncertainties into account and figure out whether they think the kind of evidence that the scientists are reporting is sufficient to rely on the hypothesis. So that's a way of hiving off the inductive risk, the decisions about inductive risk to policymakers, and avoid scientists making that decision. Now, one of the ways that Heather Douglas has expanded this argument and strengthened it is by pointing out that it's not just in setting acceptance thresholds that you can affect the balance of inductive risk. There are also a number of decisions you make earlier on in the process, such as when you decide how to design your study, how you interpret or classify your data, and all of these things can foreseeably affect what kind of evidence you end up with, which in turn, so even if you set your acceptance threshold at a certain level, you will already have made decisions that can affect inductive risk, the balance of inductive risk, and in those earlier decisions. So Douglas, for these reasons, because there are these more complicated decisions early in the process, she doesn't think it's realistic to expect policymakers to be able to, she doesn't think it's realistic for scientists to make explicit all of these decisions, at least not in a way that's going to make it possible for policymakers to take it into account. So on this basis, Douglas argues that scientists do have a duty to take the relevant value judgments into account when they're making these methodological decisions early on in the process. Now, a third view is one that, for instance, Thorsten Wilholt has defended. So Wilholt accepts that you can't make all uncertainties explicit, and that we do need to make some of these methodological decisions on a value-laden, we do need to take into account the relevant value judgments when making some of these methodological decisions. However, he resists the idea that these should be made on an individual basis by individual scientists in every single study. So he thinks the problem is that if you do that, it becomes difficult to communicate scientific results, because really, in order to rely on a result in a different context from the one where it was established, you would have to go in and really carefully check all the decisions they made and make sure that that is consistent with the kind of value judgments you would have made. And so to avoid this problem, Wilholt argues instead we should establish discipline-wide methodological standards, or methodological standards that apply within a certain field of inquiry. And that should, of course, take into account the kinds of values that are at stake within that discipline or within that field of inquiry. But then individual scientists should just follow those standards. Okay, so if we summarize some of the different accounts that are on the market here, we can sort of distinguish three different dimensions along which they can vary. So one question is, what kinds of decisions are we concerned with? Are we just looking at decisions about acceptance thresholds, or are we also looking at a broader range of methodological decisions? Secondly, we can distinguish to what extent do we think it's acceptable to accept claims that are have some uncertainty attached to them, versus to what extent should we be making those uncertainties explicit as part of the claim, as a hedged claim. And you don't have to go all the way to bets and say you always have to make all of them explicit, but you can still think that a certain amount of doing that is a good thing. And finally, there's this thing that we got from Wilholt, namely whether we want these decisions to be made in individual cases on a case-by-case basis, or whether we want some kind of discipline-wide standards. And again, you can think of this as a spectrum where you can fall in different levels to what extent you want this. You can either have just science-wide standards that applies everywhere always, or you can have very narrowly defined disciplines, and then all the way down to individual studies. Okay, so that's the framework of inductive risk that I'm working with here. And I want to come back to this question about pursuit. So the typical picture you find in at least some of the inductive risk literature is that many people will accept that decisions about pursuit are value-laden, so we can have important ethical or political debates about how we should prioritize the kind of resources that are available to scientific research. But many people will say, well, yeah, that's true, but that's not really interesting from an epistemic point of view, because those decisions haven't anything to do with acceptance. And so what many people take to be the interesting and the controversial claim is whether there are also value-laden, how we should deal with the kind of value-laden decisions that could affect acceptance. Now, Kathleen Okrolik and Kevin Elliott and Daniel McKaughan have pointed out that this division is a little bit too simplistic. So the reason is fairly simple, that when you make decisions about pursuit, that's going to affect the kinds of data and theories you have available later down the line. And that in turn is going to influence your judgments about the kind of evidential support that a theory enjoys. So the value-laden decisions that guided your decisions about pursuit can have, in this indirect way, implications for what kinds of hypotheses you end up accepting. So just to spell out the argument, the idea is that the evidential support a theory enjoys at a given time depends on what kind of data are available at that time and what other theories are available at that time. And that both of these are influenced by previous decisions about pursuit. So therefore, your value-laden decisions about pursuit can influence whether a theory is accepted. So here's an example from Elliott and McKaughan that they use to illustrate this point. So their example comes from toxicology. So for many years, in the early and mid 20th century, a thing called the threshold model was the dominant model of the dose-response relation between chemicals and their potential negative effects. So according to this model, the idea is that the effects of chemicals are close to zero for low doses, and then you get to a certain threshold, and from then on you get a rising response to your dose. Now, this model was for a long time the accepted model, and it was supported by the available evidence. So scientists who wanted to test whether drugs were safe or not naturally then focused on testing the drug at high doses, because according to a background theory, that was where you were most likely to find the kinds of effects you were interested in. More recent research, however, has started to question this model. In particular, there are two competing models that Elliott and McKaughan highlight. One of them is called the endocrine disruption model. So this model proposes that at very low doses, chemicals might end up mimicking the effects of hormones, and so could actually have negative effects, could be rising at low dose levels. So that's illustrated in the middle picture. There's another hypothesis called chemical harmosis. So according to this model, actually you might get beneficial effect from drugs at very low doses. And there's been a lot of research trying to test the effects of low dose chemicals at low doses. And at least according to Elliott and McKaughan's paper, I haven't looked at the most recent research, but at least when they wrote that paper, there was some data to support both of these alternative hypotheses. So this is a case where because you pursued a certain kind of research, you pursued questions around what are the effects of chemicals at high doses, for a long time you did not get any data that would question the threshold model. But once people started working on the endocrine disruption hypothesis and the chemical harmosis hypothesis, they started testing drugs at low dose levels more systematically, and suddenly you started getting data that questioned the threshold model. Moreover, once you had these two models on the table, it became possible to show that there were certain kinds of evidence that actually supported these models, which had previously looked like it was completely irrelevant to toxicology. So by having these alternative hypotheses on the table, you become able to evaluate a broader range of evidence, and that might become relevant to how you evaluate the evidential support for a given theory, such as the threshold model. Let me just check how I'm doing on time. Okay. Good. So, given this argument, we accept this argument that decisions about pursuit can end up affecting your decisions about acceptance. How does that relate to what I've called the entanglement between the normative standards for acceptance and pursuit? Well, here's an example. Suppose you think it's unacceptable for value-laden decisions to influence which hypotheses you end up accepting, or rather influence whether you end up accepting a given hypothesis. Well, then, if we accept the argument from O'Grolick and Elliott and McKaughan, you will need to worry about the effects of pursuit decisions that could have on the hypotheses you end up accepting. And so you'll need to come up with some kind of account of how you avoid that. And there are a few different ways you could go. So one way would be maybe sort of a Betzian way, where you have to, that's another kind of uncertainty you have to put in to your hedged hypotheses. So maybe you have to make explicit what the other possible candidates were that you could have pursued, and you might have to make explicit how that might have affected the kind of data that you ended up having available and what kind of alternative theories you had available. This starts looking maybe a little bit like a genealogical debunking argument, or could at least be the kind of reasoning you want to hedge against. Probably difficult to do this to a full extent, but you might want to build something like that into your account of the normative standards for acceptance. So that's one way you could go. Another solution, so this is the one that Orkulik argues for, would be to encourage the pursuit of a broader range of theories. So perhaps you want to have norms for pursuit that actively encourages people with very different kinds of values to pursue research within a given domain. And so the idea is that that would encourage people to explore a wider range of theories, and so you could maybe avoid that a particular set of values end up influence the kinds of theories and evidence that's available at the stage of acceptance. So that's an example where because you endorse a certain account of the normative standards for acceptance, namely that it's unacceptable for value-laden decisions to influence acceptance, you might end up having to endorse a norm for pursuit in order to counteract that. So that's an example of the entanglement between the norms for acceptance and pursuit. There are much more that could be said already here, but I'm going to raise more complications anyway, so I'm just going to push on. So what I want to talk about now is this paper. So it's written by the feminist archaeologist Joan Gero, who's very influential within the field. She wrote this article called Honoring Ambiguity / Problematizing Certitude. And what I want to do now, so she did not present this as an inductive risk argument, but I think it can be plausibly interpreted as such. And I think it raises some really interesting complications for the kind of picture of the relationship between acceptance and pursuit that I've been talking about so far. So Gero makes an argument roughly along these lines. This is not her words. This is me translating it into philosopher of science speak. But her first step is to just point out that archaeological data are messy. And she calls them ambiguous, but what she means is generally that they're very complex, and it's often not very clear that they often do not support a specific theory very clearly. And for this reason, archaeological inference is uncertain. So this is maybe one of the fundamental conundrums in the epistemology of archaeology. It's something that many people are aware of. So you're trying to make inferences about what culture and society was like thousands of years ago, but you only get to do it based on very, very partial material evidence, only the kinds of things that actually survive being underground for that long. So if you go sufficiently far back in time, it becomes very difficult to find any evidence of organic materials. So you'll only find, say, stone tools or bone tools, depending on the soil conditions. Moreover, when we're trying to interpret these societies, we know that human culture and society can be very variable and very changeable. So there's always the risk that something that looks a certain way to us might have meant something very, very different to people living several thousand years ago. And again, it's very difficult to know which of our assumptions we can actually extrapolate. So these are sort of fairly well-known problems, and a lot of archaeology, a lot of the philosophy of archaeology is trying to figure out how to deal with that fact. What Gero points out, though, is that although archaeological data is so messy, the current epistemic standards within the field tend to require researchers to be able to state their hypothesis with quite a high degree of certainty. So archaeological papers will often be presented in a rhetorical style that suggests that this really is the most plausible, maybe the only plausible interpretation of the data. And she thinks this leads to certain problematic epistemic consequences, especially if you take a feminist perspective. And so she thinks that we should change these epistemic norms. So that's a basic argument. I'm going to give you a few more details here. So some of the kinds of rhetorical moves that she's interested in are what she calls mechanisms of closure. So these are ways that archaeologists end up being able to present the data in a way that she thinks papers over how messy and ambiguous the data are. So some of them have to do with data generation and interpretation. So one mechanism she calls cleaning the data. So that's can be things like applying a label. So you classify things as bowls. You have all these ceramic vessels, and you just call them all bowls. And suddenly it looks like you have this very clean data set of different kinds of bowls, but really you're making a lot of assumptions about that these are all, just by applying the label bowl, you already have made a lot of assumptions about what these things are, what they were used for, and you're effectively assuming that they had a fairly similar purpose. And so you're hiding away some of that mess already then. She also has a mechanism she calls machining the data. So that's when you apply scientific high-tech analysis. So you might look at refraction patterns, you might look at the chemical composition of bones and so on. And the effect here is that you end up focusing on these very specific physical variables, which can often be determined with quite high precision and certainty, but that really ends up taking the focus away from all the more complex social questions that attach to that data. There are also mechanisms of closure that have more to do with how you, what kind of inferences you draw on the basis of that data. So things having to do with your hypothesis acceptance and presentation. So one of them is what she calls pushing the data. So that's when it's the kind of thing where you start by saying, oh, this might suggest that, say, this item was a bowl. And then as you go through the paper, you start just taking for granted that we've now established that this was probably a bowl, and by the time you get to the conclusion, it just was a bowl. We've shown that there was a bowl. So the caveats and the hedges sort of fall by the wayside, and you might cite papers that really just give you evidence that could suggest this hypothesis, but when they get cited by other papers, they're just presented as if they were certainties. Stretching the data is when you take a interpretation that you can maybe establish for one site, and then you assume that that's representative of an entire domain. So there's a certain building type, say, that you can find in one settlement in Roman Egypt, and then you assume that that is just how settlements in Roman Egypt look like, even though you've really just based your interpretation on data from a single site. Finally, there's something she calls visual focus. So that's basically how you design your the pictures and the illustrations you use in papers. And again, that's a way where you can present something as being just definite. You know, you put a star on the map here, that there was a city there, and that just becomes presented as this unambiguous fact that can't be questioned. And finally, some of the things she's interested in has to do with pursuit. So we've already talked a little bit about this in some of the other ones, but the idea is that if you want to be able to say things with a high degree of certainty, you become incentivized to choose your research questions such that you think it's possible to say something with a fairly high degree of certainty. So you end up focusing on small questions that can easily be answered, maybe using scientific methods. So you start spending a lot of time thinking about, oh, what was the materials of this temple? Where did they come from? And you can determine that with a fairly high degree of certainty. And then you end up not spending as much energy investigating some of the more interesting questions from a social perspective around, you know, what kinds of people use this temple, what kinds of things were they interested in, because they're much harder to answer. So so Gero argues that these are all mechanisms that people use to be able to say things with a high degree of certainty. Now, if we think of this as an inductive risk argument, you might wonder, well, is that really a problem? At least if you are attracted to Rudner's solution or to Douglas's solution to inductive risk arguments, you might think, well, look, we have uncertain data. We need to accept some hypotheses, and so we take on the inductive risk. We might be wrong about these things, but if people think that's the right value, that achieves the right balance of error given the things they value, that's perfectly fine. But Gero does not think that, and she argues that because of certain feminist values that she thinks archaeologists should accept, we should be skeptical about that move to paper over these uncertainties. And she highlights two things in her paper. Firstly, she claims that feminists should be committed to resisting power. Specifically, they should at least be skeptical of conventions and practices that allow people to assert power. And that's to do with concerns about who is willing or able to state conclusions with a high degree of confidence, maybe even exaggerated confidence in her view. That will often be people who already have high status, high authority within a given field, so that will tend to push out, make it more difficult for scholars and researchers to succeed who maybe do not have the social background that enables them to get away with stating conclusions with a high degree of confidence. More generally, she worries that being able to deliver results very unambiguously and with a high degree of confidence is also a way to shore up power and authority. So you've shown that you can publish papers where you seem to establish things with a high degree of certainty. That makes you an authority, and then that allows you to do even more of that in your future work. And she's skeptical of this, and she thinks we should resist this. That's one of the values that Gero highlights. The other one is one of opening up interpretive space. She doesn't say as much about this one, but we'll see some examples of this in a bit. But this is the ones that are relevant to questions about which of the questions you might pursue are easiest to gain strong data on. Questions around what kinds of populations were most likely to leave behind rich material evidence, and which and whose assumptions are most likely to be accepted as plausible when we make judgments about what we should accept and what we should pursue. And so she thinks that feminists should be committed to opening up interpretive space because she thinks that there are populations that are less dominant or were less dominant in the past are less likely to leave behind rich material evidence, at least in many cases. And so, and those are often the kind of populations that feminists would be interested in to tell stories and do research on. So if you have this emphasis on certainty, it becomes more difficult to justify doing research on those populations. So to summarize, just thinking about this again as an inductive risk argument, Gero highlights certain kinds of direct inductive risks. So these have to do with accepting interpretations as overly certain. So we might think of that as being a kind of inductive risk where it's not to do with whether it's a false positive or a false negative, but it's to do with whether the kind of uncertainty claims you make about your hypotheses, whether they are appropriate. She thinks that it's problematic if you end up stating things with too high degree of certainty. And she also is worried about the failure to accept certain kinds of interpretations that might be more speculative, but might concern populations that we would be interested to know more about. So there are some direct inductive risks at play here. There are also some more indirect impacts on pursuit. So these norms of having to be able to state claims with a high degree of certainty disincentivizes pursuits where certainty is perceived as being less likely, because if you need to be able to show things with a high degree of confidence, well, if a certain research question looks unlikely to be able to yield that kind of data that would allow you to do that, well, you'll be disincentivized from pursuing that kind of research. And it also, maybe in a more pernicious way, locks in received interpretations, because if the interpretations that are presented are just presented as these certainties that are just overwhelmingly supported by the evidence, and you don't really spend much time talking about what possible alternative candidates were here, well, those alternatives won't come up as much in the literature, and so they won't be regarded as salient hypotheses you might pursue instead. And so by having these high standards for acceptance, you end up incentivizing and locking in certain kinds of pursuits. And then to make things even more complicated, as we saw earlier, if you end up having certain kinds of values influencing what kinds of things get pursued, that can have downstream impacts on acceptance, because it dictates what kind of theory data become available, and this can in turn influence our perceptions of plausibility and where we will be likely to attain certainty. So just to wrap this up in a nice picture, I think we get something looking maybe a bit like this, where how we set our epistemic standards doesn't just have direct impact on inductive risk, but it also has these looping back effects where you end up influencing future pursuit decisions and your future interpretations of the data, which in turn is going to influence what you end up accepting in the future, generating more inductive risks and so on. So this, I think, is the kind of picture that's implicit in Gero's argument. Now, what's interesting is that Gero does not propose a model for dealing with inductive risk that's analogous to Douglas. So she doesn't think that archaeologists should just lower their acceptance thresholds and be willing to accept hypotheses that have less evidence supporting them. Rather, she says something that sounds a little bit like Betts, namely that archaeologists should make the ambiguities and uncertainties explicit. But she also goes beyond what Betts says. So it's not just that when you have uncertainty, you should make it explicit. She argues that archaeologists should actively try to open up space for speculation and imaginings. She argues that they should lay out as many interpretations as the data can accommodate. So you should actively try and seek out alternative interpretations. And she thinks we should, archaeologists should revise the reward structures within their field so that you actively incentivize these kinds of pursuits. So pursuits trying to explore speculative theories, trying to highlight uncertainties that you might have missed previously. So this goes beyond Betts by also having this these norms that are related to pursuit rather than just norms around acceptance. I think the reasons she ends up with these conclusions, I think there are a couple of different things we can say here. One of them is, of course, that archaeological interpretation rarely inputs directly into policy decisions. So it's disanalogous from your standard cases of inductive risk where, either you accept, if you accept a hypothesis, there are certain kinds of policy decisions that just follow directly. And if you reject it, there are other kinds of policy decisions. So in that way, it doesn't matter in the same way whether you end up accepting or rejecting a hypothesis with certain kinds of hedges or not, or whether people are able to interpret those hedges appropriately. A second feature is that many of the risks that Gero are concerned with here they seem to be ones that you can mitigate by having just a hedged hypothesis on the table. So if you think of things like not being able to do research on certain populations, non-dominant populations, well, you can do research and you can end up with these hedged hypotheses if you're not able to get enough evidence. And that's fine, because you're still incentivizing the research and you do learn more, even if you're not able to state things as strongly for those populations as you might for the dominant populations. And finally, the final thing I want to highlight is that Gero does seem to pay close attention to the interplay of acceptance and pursuit. So you have this normative entanglement that I've been talking about, and that is one of the reasons why she has to articulate her norms in concert. Okay, so I've just got to notice that we are 45 minutes in, and I promised you I was going to say something about Viking warriors. So here we are. So this is a case study that I'm very excited about, and it's also a bit complex, and it's an ongoing debate. But I think some of the things I've been thinking about along acceptance and pursuit are relevant here. So I'm going to just give you a flavor of what's going on in this case, in this debate, and then I'm going to end this talk by saying a bit about why I think this account of acceptance and pursuit I've been arguing for, why that is helpful for thinking about this case. So the debate about female Viking warriors, or the current one that's going on, was sparked by this paper from 2017 by Hedenstierna, Johnson, and colleagues, where they claim that a female Viking warrior is confirmed by genomics. So this was published in 2017, and then there's this follow-up paper by the same group of authors from 2019, where they go into some more detail around this interpretation. So this paper concerns a grave in the Viking settlement of Birka, which is just west of Stockholm. And in particular, there was one grave, BJ 581, which was excavated, and it had a very extensive collection of weapons, amongst other things. It also had gaming pieces. It had 2 sacrificed horses in there. And it was already then considered quite an extraordinary grave. Now, it was originally assumed to be a man. The original excavator thought this was a mighty warrior. However, it turned out, actually already in the 70s, archaeologists discovered that this skeleton was female rather than male. Originally, that was ignored, possibly because it wasn't clear that the skeleton was the one that had been buried with these items. So in the storage, the bones and the items had become separated. But the archaeologist Anna Källström, who was one of the authors in this paper, she did a study on the material from Birka, and she discovered, amongst other things, that these bones were osteologically, she judged them to be female, and she had other archaeologists examine them without knowing where they came from, and they also concluded that this was a female skeleton. So this was quite an interesting discovery. A lot of people were suspicious or skeptical that this really was the right skeleton. So some people wondered whether it really was a male skeleton. Some wondered whether maybe these bones that were used to sex the skeleton had been mixed up and they weren't the ones that came from the grave. So just to prove the point, they went ahead and did this genomics testing, and they showed that, first of all the bones came from the same individual, and all the bones were marked with BJ 581. So that was pretty clear evidence that this was the right skeleton that was associated with these items. And secondly, that this did indeed have 2 X chromosomes, even though the osteological evidence was already pretty strong. So nonetheless, making this kind of strong claim does get archaeologists skeptical. So there was a lot of debate. Some people continued to question the material facts. Were these really the bones? And some of the things they argue in the follow-up piece is just to hammer home that people seem to be extraordinarily skeptical of the claim that that these bones are female, and they're actually the authors of this paper were actually a bit offended that people thought they'd been so sloppy that they couldn't tell where the bones came from. So I think a more interesting objection people have raised is, well, should we interpret this as a female Viking warrior? So granted the material facts, these were an osteologically or biologically female skeleton that we found in a grave containing all these weapons. Should we interpret it as a female Viking warrior? In particular, one way of interpreting this question is by focusing on the warrior bit. So saying that's quite common in archaeology is the dead do not bury themselves. And so this is a reminder that what you see in a grave is a reflection of what the people who buried the person wanted to demonstrate to the other people observing the burial. And that does not necessarily correspond to what the person themselves would have wanted, or indeed what kind of life they lived in when they were alive. And they do address this question. So they ask, do weapons necessarily determine a warrior? The interpretation of grave goods is not straightforward, but it must be stressed that the interpretation should be made in a similar manner, regardless of the biological sex of the interred individual. And so they're worried here that people are suddenly becoming overly skeptical of something that people all along had assumed was a warrior grave. And once it turns out that it's a female, it's a biologically female body, suddenly they start raising these questions around, oh, well, can we really be sure that weapons means a warrior? So they seem to be endorsing the symmetry principle here, where if you have the same grave goods, you should give the same social interpretation regardless of the sex of the individual. Now, one thing you might say here is, well, even if you endorse this symmetry principle, couldn't you just still say, well, maybe we have been too quick when we've generally assumed that weapons means warrior, even when it comes to graves with biologically male body in them. And so just because people in the past have been naive about their warrior interpretations, and they may have also been sexist when suddenly they become skeptical of the interpretation when there's a female skeleton, that doesn't mean that we should make the same mistake they did. But there's also a question of background evidence. So you shouldn't just interpret a grave based on the grave goods. There is various kinds of evidence. I won't go into the detail here. But there might be prior evidence that gives you reason to think that it is more likely that if you have weapons and male bones, that this was a warrior than if it were female weapons and female bones and buried with weapons. This is all controversial. We can talk about Q&A about the details here. So the final bit I just wanted to get to was that more recently, some people have started focusing more on the female bit. So even if this is a biologically female body, what does that say about the gender or queer identity of this individual? So suppose we do accept that the individual who was interred in this grave did own and use the weapons in their life. Does that automatically mean that they would have been identified as or perceived as a female warrior or a woman? There are questions around whether we can possibly know this. Now, some people have tried to argue this. So some people have pointed out that the placement of the sword in the grave apparently does not match the pattern you see in most other graves. So that might suggest that they had an unusual identity. It's an interesting argument. I don't think you can make it without qualification. There are also some interesting questions scholars have started to raise around the values that are at stake here. And so some of the values are about our obligations to the dead. Well, suppose this individual was in fact a queer person, or maybe they had something that we today would call a trans identity. are we doing them an injustice if we just assume this is a female Viking warrior? They might have identified as a male Viking warrior, or maybe they would have identified as having a queer identity that doesn't really match onto the binary. And this idea that we have certain obligations to the dead is quite a common one in the ethics of archaeology. There might also be certain obligations, certain values regarding the living. So by putting certain kinds of hypotheses on the table, for instance, the possibility that there might have been various kinds of queer people in the past, which there definitely were, but by exploring those possibilities, we are making it more plausible that, or more natural to think that there will also be queers in the future, and that is something that we might quite rightly want to ensure. Okay, so I'll wrap up here, just with some reflection on how this relates to what I've been saying about pursuit and acceptance. So one thing to notice is that some of these initial debates seem to be driven very much by a desire to affirm or deny certainty about claims such as a female Viking warrior was confirmed by genomics. So I think we can take some lessons from Gero's argument, and maybe those debates would have been more productive if people hadn't been so focused on just trying to assert something with a lot of certainty. We also have here an illustration of how once we start asking questions about the perception or subjectivity of marginal or non-dominant groups in society, it's likely that we will just have to be more speculative about the hypotheses we investigate. And so this seems to be grist in the mill for this argument that you don't want to disincentivize that kind of research. And finally, this seems to me to be a good example of where Gero's account does give us quite a plausible way of balancing the different values at stake here. So if we leave space for and incentivize the exploration of these more speculative claims about the gender or queer identity of past individuals, then we can serve these purposes of making it plausible that they existed in the past, or at least exploring ways that those kinds of identities did exist in the past, without necessarily imposing a lot of gender roles unqualifiedly onto the individual. Okay, so these were just my concluding reflections. I look forward to discussing all of this stuff with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rune. And for those who know our custom with the Postdoc Forum, there is a commentator, and today that is me. So I will jump right to it so that we can get to our general discussion time. So people should be able to see my screen now. And I'm just going to jump right in with 4 kind of core questions to raise. What is the relevant epistemic unit? How do we understand pursuit? What exactly is being risked? And how do we honor ambiguity? So on that first question, Nyrup frames the primary question in terms of theory choice. It's not clear that theories are the only relevant unit to choose from, especially once we are considering the broader process of investigation with its many dimensions extended through time. Why not contemplate other epistemic units? They could be more minimal, like hypotheses, or more maximal, like research programs. Obviously, there's a lot to choose from. But this raises questions about the different kinds of normative standards that are associated with those different units. You obviously evaluate a hypothesis differently from a research program. And once you've got multiple units in play, entanglement relations of the kind Rune described are going to multiply. Second question, how do we understand pursuit? What exactly do we mean in talking about pursuit in the sciences? Obviously, the distinction traces back to Loudon, but I think it's worth comparing explicitly because the notion of acceptance is a little bit tighter in certain ways. If I'm testing a theory, am I also pursuing it? Should I think of pursuit in terms of other units, such as pursuing a research program? Pursuit seems applicable to a wider range of activities. I could pursue or accept a theory but I cannot accept a research program in a straightforward way. I might even accept one theory while pursuing another within a research program that I'm pursuing. This wider range of applicability seems worth pondering for questions of inductive risk that Rune brings up, and different associated normative standards that are going to co-travel with them. What exactly is being risked? Clearly, scientific inquiry is uncertain. However, what do we mean in saying that it risks erring? What is the space of errors we are balancing? Is it some combination of different kinds of epistemological errors? Does it involve ethical errors? What exactly are we concerned about? And the methodological choices that we would engage in to do the balancing is going to turn on that space of errors, and what values might come to bear in doing the balancing. So we can see here that our questions start to compound because we can see that they are interrelated. So we might ask, what is inductive risk in a research program, for example? We might ask, how does one make an error in pursuit? What exactly do we want to say? Is that an ethical error? Is it epistemological error? What is involved there? And should we think about these questions in terms of individuals or groups? Rune brought this up. Is it a particular individual who is in danger of risking in the pursuit, or is it groups of scientists, disciplines, some other kind of arrangement? Now, for inductive risk in particular, the original discussion had a very clearly defined space for balancing in terms of the acceptance thresholds for statistical hypothesis testing, with errors either being false positives or false negatives. It isn't clear that inductive risk is going to have such a defined shape in other contexts, such as in the pursuit of a research program. So this seems especially pertinent once the balancing that needs to be done must occur in a temporally extended fashion across multiple activities in a process of research, which fits with what others have argued. And you might even think that individuals like Betts are trying to recover a simpler space in their arguments, because that then makes the decision-making process, or at least apportioning the responsibilities within it, more straightforward. Finally, how do we honor ambiguity? According to Nyrup, Gero argues that we honor ambiguity by making it and its associated uncertainties explicit. This has the consequence of opening up interpretive space, understood primarily as alternative interpretations of data. So honoring ambiguity would suggest we seek to maximize as many interpretations as the data can accommodate, rather than only accepting those interpretations permitted by a strict standard of material evidence, at least in archaeology, which discounts the pursuit of questions concerning marginal groups that are less likely to leave behind this type of unambiguous material evidence. Of course, one of the things that we would want to ask here is what counts as data, because I think in the female Viking warrior case, it's quite clear that the genomic data in part instigates some of the controversy because there is a way in which it has a different kind of status, say, compared to how people think about the grave goods or osteology. So that might be another thing to think about in terms of the what counts as the unambiguous evidence. But Gero's argument is that researchers are not going to pursue a strategy of honoring ambiguity unless there is a revision to the reward structure that's going to incentivize that process and activity of generating alternative interpretations through speculation and imagination. You need to somehow have a reward for that. Now, others have talked about speculation. Adrian Curry's book on historical science talks about it. His argument is not in terms of inductive risk, but something like fecundity. He said the bold and the speculative is more fruitful, generates more opportunities for testing, unlocks new avenues of investigation, links our little pockets of knowledge to each other, and is, let's face it, more satisfying and fun. Here, the important thing is just that the risk of error or getting it wrong is not really foregrounded, and in fact, it's trumped by this kind of generativity that comes from the speculation. So we might think there's alternative ways to cast Gero's concern, and that might then suggest we don't need to maximize alternative interpretations, and there might be straightforward ways, or at least more straightforward ways, of navigating the reward structure and incentivization issues. Finally, given that the honoring of ambiguity occurs in the temporally extended process of scientific pursuit, we might want a stopping rule. I think that's one of the things that is at stake in the mechanisms of closure that Rune mentioned. Gero's argument might harbor an assumption that the maximum number of interpretations the data can accommodate will decrease over time until it arrives at only one that remains, and we could think about that as somehow the long-term sequence of investigation. This doesn't really appear plausible, given that different interpretations of data may derive from different sets of normative standards, depending on how pursuit and risk are conceptualized, and therefore even potentially increase over time, especially as different research programs accumulate divergent histories. But maybe that was what Gero is hoping for, that basically we would be honoring ambiguity in perpetuity to regard with great respect forever in some ways. So with that, I will stop and turn us towards our time for questions. So Rune, go ahead and turn your camera on and come back. I will turn my camera off. What we have now is the opportunity for open questions. I'm going to let Rune start by responding to my comments. While he is doing that, you may either use the raised hand function or add a question to the chat, and then I will call on you, and then you can ask Rune your question. So Rune, I hand it back to you for some reflections on my comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. I think they touched on a lot of important things, and I don't want to spend too much time from the question time. Maybe just a few remarks. And the first two questions around what are we pursuing and what does it mean to pursue things? I mean, the argument I've given is fairly high level, so I've tried not to commit too much to those details. And in some way, if you accept this idea that you need to articulate your account of acceptance and pursuit in concert, you might think that those details are just things you need to work out as part of your general epistemological theory. I'll mention that Marina DiMarco and Karim Khalifa has recently proposed that you can construe all of pursuit in terms of you're always pursuing a question. And so you might think that if the pursuit, that the object of pursuit is always a question, that might provide a neat framework to try and deal with some of these complexities that you highlight. I haven't thought through systematically whether that's compatible with the arguing here, but I don't see an obvious reason that it wouldn't be. So one, I think, slight misunderstanding that's maybe good to correct. So Alan, you mentioned that you asked what are we risking in pursuit? What is it to err in pursuing something? So when I talk about errors in this context, I do still mean inductive risk errors of the standard kind. So they're errors in what you end up accepting. And so I tend to have a fairly consequentialist view of the norms for pursuit. So the kind of risks you run really just are, at the end of the day, given that you pursue a certain question or a certain hypothesis, what kinds of epistemic states are you going to end up with? And so your risks are still, you might pursue something that if you pursue it using certain epistemic norms, you end up risking making certain kinds of mistakes. And that's one of the ways that these two things are entangled. Maybe a final remark on the final question: does Gero want just to honor ambiguity in perpetuity? So I think she does think that we learn new things, and sometimes we might be able to settle a question. So she's not ruling that out. Although I guess I don't think she assumes that. I don't think she has an assumption that we will necessarily converge on a single hypothesis. My sense is that she would be happy to some extent for things to stay open as long as they will, and potentially forever. And this relates to a point I did make in passing that at least within archaeology, some of the value that we get from archaeological inquiry, it's often not necessary for us to actually settle a question conclusively. If it's more to do with values around partly, telling stories about the past and having maybe we have a certain obligation to accurately talk about the past. It's not necessary for us to accept conclusive hypotheses about the past to still talk about it in ways that are in certain ways accurate. Similarly, if some of our ethical concerns are more along the political effects of having certain kinds of hypotheses on the table, does it allow us to see a future for certain kinds of populations, certain kinds of people? Again, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to say that definitely was a trans person in the Viking Age for that kind of purpose to be served. You can serve that purpose fairly well by saying, well, there's a person here who seems to, on the one hand, be biologically female, but had a role that involved things that we have reason to think were typically regarded as male. It's plausible that they had some kind of identity that was outside of the norm and might not have fit perfectly or might not have fit smoothly within the dominant gender roles of that age. So much more open-ended hypothesis, and you might then start exploring different possibilities within that sort of general question. And already in doing that, you might never actually come to any conclusion about what the gender identity, any firm conclusions about what the identity of this person was like. But you can explore different hypotheses, and in that process, make space for those conversations also to happen in the present. So in that way, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, given the kinds of values that are at stake in these kinds of contexts, if we end up honoring ambiguity in perpetuity with great respect forever. So those were my thoughts, but I'm looking forward to other people's questions.
Yes, and thank you for that thoughtful response and some clarifications about your argument. So the floor is currently open for any questions that people have for Rune. Again, you can either use the raise hand function or you can type into the chat directly, whichever is preferable to you. Any questions that people want to ask Rune?
I'm very happy to talk more about the female Viking warriors case if anybody is curious about some of the details.
All right, we seem to have a reticent group today. Here comes one into the chat from Sam Fletcher. To what extent would you agree that Gero was making a Feyerabendian argument, especially in his invocation of the million marketplace of ideas? If so, to what extent do you think Feyerabend interfaces with literature on inductive risk?
Yeah, thanks. So if I take the direction of this question correctly, if you think about if the million marketplace of ideas, I take it there are two different kinds of things people point out. So one is this idea that you will, if we debate all the ideas in the marketplace of ideas, we will slowly converge on the true one. And so having lots of different hypotheses out there is a good thing, even if what you care about is getting to the one true answer in the end. And I think that one is not so much what Gero has in mind, just because I think she would be fine with just no convergence to happen. But there's also this other part of Mill's argument, which is more to do with the value of holding an idea. What is the phrase he uses? Basically, if you don't have your ideas challenged, even if you're right, your belief in the idea ends up becoming this pale shadow that's not really worth having in the first place. And again, I don't think that's so much what she's after. It's not so much to do with having your ideas challenged for the sake of the person having that idea. It's more to do with what kinds of ideas you end up having available um, to you and what kinds of ideas end up being explored. And as we saw in the case with the some of the arguments around gender identity for the Viking grave, it might be fine just to explore those ideas without necessarily coming to a conclusion. Now, this might still sound fairly Feyerabendian in some ways. I have to admit I'm not much of a Feyerabend scholar, so I don't know to what extent he interfaces with inductive risk, so I don't think I can answer the second part of that question very well.
Okay. Other questions for Rune? If not, then I am going to bring you back to one of my concerns, which is that you clarified nicely that you were thinking about the error in the inductive risk argument in the sort of acceptance dimension ultimately, and that to err is in some sense to at a base root level be engaged in something like false positives or false negatives, even if it doesn't have the sort of bright structure of a statistical hypothesis test or something like that. But I take it that we might want to also be able to have an account of error in the sense of adopting the wrong strategies for approaching questions, or somehow choosing methodologies that might yield very, clean tests of hypotheses, but actually, only by virtue of having made the wrong choice about how to pursue the question in view. So I'm curious, is it that are you open to that kind of contemplation of how we might think about inductive risk?
So I definitely think we can evaluate decisions about pursuit. So I think we can have normative standards for that. I think we can evaluate those decisions. I tend to think of it in a fairly straightforward consequentialist way, like even decision theoretically, there's a certain candidate for pursuit, and you think about, well, what are the different possible epistemic states I could end up in? If I pursue a given hypothesis, I might end up accepting it, but it turns out it's false. I might end up rejecting it, but it turns out it's true, but I might also accept something true, and so on. And you can complicate that model if you want to have a more fine-grained set of epistemic states, and you might also want to have a more fine-grained set of states of the world apart from just true and false. You might have different degrees of accuracy.
I guess it seems like you
maybe
want
I'm misunderstanding you.
No, I guess I guess I was seeing that you want something like that if you are pursuing Gero's account, where the honoring of ambiguity might be very open-ended. Then if your only way of talking about error is in terms of the truth or falsity of the hypothesis, and you're not necessarily in a position to make those determinations, you would either be in a position to say, well, we couldn't have made an error, or we couldn't have determined that we made an error, or that we would have to be thinking about error in a different sense, and maybe that sense would be something like the kinds of commitments we bring to the inquiry in the first place, and whether or not those could be thought to be the wrong ones, or to be inappropriate in some respect.
Good. Okay, thank you. So I think I understand the shape of your question better now. you know, it would be nice to have a good account of the kinds of values. I think the idea is the kind of values you should have guiding
Right.
your pursuits. Um, and I mean, there's maybe sometimes something that's missing a little bit from the inductive risk literature is, people pointing, oh, it's value laden, so we need to have values. And there's sort of question of, well, whose values, which values? Just any value? Do we want fascist values to guide our pursuits? That doesn't sound great. Or even the values we use to accept hypotheses in the original inductive risk arguments. But I guess I don't have so I think we should evaluate those values the way we evaluate them in general, sort of from an ethical, political point of view. And I guess it's just not being an ethicist or a political philosopher, at least not in this domain. I don't have sort of a ready-made account of how we do that exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, okay, we've got two things that came in the chat. One, a clarification of the earlier question. We'll go to that one first. Just to clarify what Feyerabend called the principle of proliferation and the arguments I was referring to, this is Sam Fletcher again, had the following function. By proliferating theoretical alternatives, we can better detect anomalies and establish theories, regardless of whether it converges to the truth. Feyerabend invoked Mill, but didn't hold exactly the same position regarding the marketplace ideas.
Yeah, so the focus is more on figuring out the limitations of established theories rather than sort of ideas around convergence. So I think that might be there might be more of that in Gero. She's definitely worried about establishing things with undue certainty. She thinks that's very rare we can do that, and maybe there is this idea that proliferating theories will enable us to sort of take down the established ones a peg.
Okay. So I think we'll take this as the last question because it's sort of asking you to comment more broadly on the female Viking warrior case. And I think it links up with this concern about kind of honoring ambiguity and perpetuity and how does that bear on particular claims. So this is Ron Williams. It says, thanks for the presentation. How seriously do you think we should take the suggestion that the skeleton was from a body of a trans person so many centuries ago? And I think this is an invitation to kind of comment more generally on these kinds of claims.
Yeah. I mean, this is obviously a tricky question. It really gets to the core of some of these worries in general in archaeological interpretation of, do we risk imposing categories that are very modern? How do we know whether there are assumptions and social categories really are applicable? There has been some studies, often relying on the literary sources, which has to be said were written by Christian monks a couple of centuries after the events they purport to describe, so they are already tricky to interpret. But what some people have argued, so maybe I can say that some of the theories out there don't so much use the category of a trans person, so that was maybe a bit of a quick gloss from me. They're more interested. They often argue instead that there might have been a different gender system from the one we have today. So rather than there being a two-gender binary, instead there's what they call the one-gender model. So the idea is there's one gender, that's man, and women are just seen as imperfect approximations to men. Now, this, of course, devalues women, but it also means that individuals have more flexibility in which roles they can attain. So if you end up doing manly things, you just are, in a sense, a man. It doesn't really matter what kind of body you have. So that's sort of a different kinds of, I guess we would call it a queer identity, which doesn't really fit into the categorizations of trans person because it just has a different relationship between sex and gender. And I think that, I mean, I haven't got the expertise to evaluate that argument in detail. I think it has some plausibility, and I think we should take it seriously in the sense of it's something that's worth investigating and pursuing.
Well, thank you, Rune, for your presentation and for the discussion today. I really appreciate you taking the time, staying up late to join us here. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us today and participate online. And join us again sometime soon. But in the meantime, everyone have a safe, happy, and healthy weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.